Before we begin, I want you to slide on over to globalrefuge.org and hit the donate button to help design a better welcome to the people coming to the U.S. for a better life. Support for Designed By comes from generous donations from listeners like you. Visit aidesigncorps.org/donate.
Political leaders on both sides of the aisle, not standing up for our country being a welcoming nation. And I just know that whether it's the economic self-interest, the national security considerations, the history of our nation, immigrants and immigration are critical to us remaining a superpower.
Scanning all frequencies. Hello.
Welcome back to Designed By. I couldn't be more excited about our guest today, Krish O'Mara Vignarajah. I've had the opportunity of knowing Krish for several years now in several different capacities. And one of the things that I've really cherished about getting to know each other both in our professional lives and now in personal life is that Krish's story is so unique. And I think so unique in a way that has, I think, some real meaning to this time that we find ourselves in. So without further ado, Krish, welcome to the show. Let's talk about where your story begins.
So I guess you could say my origin story began in Sri Lanka. I was born there as the country was descending into civil war. My family was part of the ethnic and religious minority, and my parents knew that it wasn't safe for themselves and certainly for two young children. So they made the unthinkably difficult decision to leave their homeland. In many ways, we were lucky because, while there was xenophobia, of course, that is kind of an age-old concept in terms of the U.S. and the willingness to be a welcoming nation. My uncle had traveled to be a doctor in rural Texas, and he had sponsored the rest of the family. And we, didn't know what would happen with the visa. There was a point where my parents, I think, just got more and more desperate. They actually took jobs to teach in Nigeria, northern Nigeria. So they had the jobs in hand, plane tickets. Our bags were packed. We were going to move to northern Nigeria when, just in the nick of time, our visas were processed and we came to the U.S. It was obviously, challenging, the idea for them of uprooting from the only country that they knew to come to the U.S. with no jobs, just a couple $100 in their pockets and two very young kids in their arms. But I think desperation engenders courage. And, I think my parents naturally, like so many parents, would do anything in the world to protect their children, to give them a better and safer future. And so thankfully, due to the generosity and the warm welcome from our new community in Baltimore, my parents were able to find jobs as public school teachers. And ultimately, we were able to plant roots and build a life here. And I think that's why this work as president and CEO of Global Refuge is so personally rewarding to me, because I get to pay forward some of the compassion we experienced to today's generation of families in need.
It's an incredible journey. And I think it's one that has taken you through not just, you didn't just arrive and become the CEO of an organization. I would imagine it was peppered with, I think, a lot of opportunity, but also I would imagine a lot of struggle. I mean, I would imagine that being a first generation in America would have had a number of hurdles, particularly in school. I think it's great, and I think it's always awesome that they were able to come here and immediately come into the space of teaching.
So my parents' generation, or at least my parents, had this approach of our children need to speak perfect English. We want to make sure they are integrated and they grow up thinking of themselves as Americans. And so, learning my parents' native language was not as important. These days, I feel like so many of my friends, one parent speaks one language, the other parent speaks the other. If they have resources, they hire a Mandarin Chinese, au pair, Spanish speaking nanny. And so I think it is interesting to see how, there's a little bit of a generational shift. For me, I will say and give credit to the community in Baltimore. It is such a diverse community. It had always been so welcoming, whether it was the neighbors in the apartment building where, we spent our first few years, who would kind of chip in and be babysitters as my mom was looking for a job. Churches, temples who, would help with like donations, making sure that we had warm clothes, given that we came from a tropical island. But of course, I still see a little bit of the struggle of just, difference is sometimes viewed as kind of in a derogatory fashion.
Hmm.
Um, and so, there's always kind of the like if you brought a native food, kind of like, oh, that smells bad, or that's disgusting. It looks like something inedible, or worse. And so you realize, and I get a little sheepish about South Asian food,
Hmm.
or the smell of curry. And of course, these days, if I smell it, it smells like home. It smells like something wonderfully delectable. But I think when you're younger, you don't have that confidence necessarily.
I certainly can, I certainly actually connect with that, it's interesting. One question I've got for you in kind of in that vein is, similarly, I came out of a generation that it was very much, in the Mexican American diaspora, where it was learn English, assimilate. And that was far more important than us being able to speak Spanish. The only reason I can speak Spanish is because I was a translator for my grandmother, and so, but it wasn't ever, "You should know these 2 things," and I think that's a phenomenal advancement and maybe push forward that maybe our early generation didn't have. But in that part of, the wanting to fit in, particularly when we're young and you are an only maybe in that community, to the point of, foods that may be unique to you. I mean, I remember not wanting to bring in food, but it was like, oh, what if I just buy the same food that everybody else has? And that was something that was kind of not necessarily a way of kind of hiding, but just wanting to fit in with the other kids. Did you ever experience anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's funny, right, when you look back at it now, because you're like, oh my gosh, if I had the option of, a dosa is like a kind of a sourdough pancake
Yeah.
versus French fries. There's no choice in my mind, right? Like, of
No,
course,
none.
I'm going to pick the former. Um, and yet at that age, yeah, you want to fit in. You don't want to do anything that singles you out. Um, and I do, I think some of that is just, it is age old, and it is age related. Even with my daughter, in some ways, I can see that having an Irish Catholic um, father from upstate New York, and a South Asian, Sri Lankan American mother, like there is something so colorful about kind of parts of her ethnic background that she embraces in a way that kind of more than I did. And so I think that's been a difference I see in like the younger generation. But certainly, as you're describing it, there is definitely that age where you're like, oh my gosh, this is so awkward.
Absolutely. You are certainly a leader in public service, but I'm sure that, and one question that I've got for you is, you know, I'm there's a part of me that says, did little Krish always dream of going to the White House, or being in public service, or even being in the Foreign Service during your years at Foggy Bottom? Where does the journey begin to accelerate into the space of public service?
Yeah, also a great question, because I think uh, I certainly had no ambitions for the White House when I was younger. But I do think, my parents, you just saw my mom make her guest appearance, uh, and my dad kind of always had um, the hope that we would realize our potential. And of course, in their biased minds, our potential was limitless. And so I think in that way, I got the encouragement to just, to take advantage of the opportunity, to be thankful for our good fortune, to find some way to pay it forward. I think that certainly drove me into public service. And so, it wasn't like I went to school thinking, okay, how do I become a banker or a successful lawyer? I joke with my parents these days because they're like, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to make some money for a little while. And I'm like, well, it's kind of you ingrained this in us. But I know they wanted us to do well. They wanted us to apply ourselves, and to not, phone it in, because they
Mhm.
knew we had the good luck of coming to the US, and that so many uh, people, whether it was, in our home country of Sri Lanka, um, didn't just not have that good fortune, but in fact faced, the great violence of a civil war, especially the ethnic and religious minority of Hindus and Tamils. It was far, far worse. And so I think that, kind of with age, I certainly had a little bit more perspective about coming from the global South, kind of what that meant, and not taking anything for granted. But then, yeah, as I got a little older, I knew I wanted to go to certain schools, and I hoped that I could find some way, to kind of be academically successful, be able to, be a leader in policy, and to just have an impact, in terms of U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy, development policy. That's kind of where my passions took me.
Talk to me a little bit about that early part of your education, because if I remember correctly, you spent some time at Yale. You also were a Marshall Scholar at Oxford. These are not small feats. By the way, that's just the middle of the story that from my understanding. There's so much more. Tell me a little bit about some of those choices into the first college, those first steps into a much larger world.
Yeah, so it's embarrassing to say that my version of rebelling was going to Yale ultimately. So this sounds ridiculous, but when my brother had declared that he wanted to go to Yale, I declared that I would go to Harvard. And I actually visited Harvard my freshman year of high school. And I realized that I just didn't like it. I mean, obviously it's a world-class university, but I just, when I visited Cambridge, it just didn't kind of have the feel. And maybe it's because, coming from the kind of Baltimore region, it didn't feel like home in the way that when I visited New Haven, uh, and at that time my brother, had was just about to become a freshman. um I just had an incredible experience there, and I felt sort of inspired by the campus, by its surroundings. And so ultimately I knew kind of my heart was set on going to Yale. So I went to Yale. It was an eye-opening experience. I went to a public school in Baltimore County. Many people know it because of the Serial podcast, and the
Mhm.
murder that happened at Woodlawn High School. But I went to college thinking that's where you learned things. Kind of everything else was like a preparatory school for college, which is where you gained knowledge.
Mhm.
Little did I know that, especially, my classmates who were coming from New England prep schools, had already received a college level world class education. And so I definitely felt like I had to play catch up. But in that came drive, because I knew, I'm a competitive person by nature. I knew that I needed to really step up my game. So I took college very seriously. I, worked around the clock. I wanted to get as much as I could out of it, knowing that my parents and I had taken tens of thousands of dollars out in student loans, because, we were on a one income public school teacher salary. And so I ultimately majored in molecular cellular and developmental biology, but also decided to get my master's, all in 4 years. So it meant for my, kind of for half of college, I was taking 7 classes. in addition to, playing tennis on our Division 3 tennis team and mock trial debate and stuff. So it was a lot, but I'm one of those people, you kind of know your DNA. I'm so much better when I am busy than
Yeah.
when I'm not. Um, I think I was lucky that I found myself and what I loved, and I also found confidence. You come into a world class university like Yale, and you're not sure kind of if you can you can compete, and that's, I think, when I started understanding my lifelong mantra of fake it till you make it. And so then I was very lucky, to graduate Phi Beta Kappa magna cum laude, get a Marshall Scholarship to study at Oxford. It is also where I learned that I was not going to go to medical school. I, had thought about going into health policy, kind of prepared to go and get my law degree and my medical degree. But then I just realized that though I do care a lot about development policy, I care a lot about public health policy. You don't necessarily have to commit 4 years to medical school. So that was a very important realization I came to at that age. Don't get me wrong, I still was in school for a very long time, but I ended up going to Oxford studying international relations, and then spent a year in between at McKinsey because I had never taken an econ course. So I figured it'd be good to get some, kind of on the ground in the job training. And then I wasn't terribly creative. So I went back to Yale for law school.
Gotcha, gotcha. So at what point do you get bit by, um, by the political bug? Because you go from, going a tremendous amount of schooling, and I would imagine that's very much heads down in a place trying to
Yeah.
find, and then also finding the time, I would imagine, on during summers, kind of looking for what that next thing is going to be, or how you're going to apply all that education.
Yeah. So it was interesting, to your question about kind of getting more politically involved. Up until that point, I honestly had not been political at all. Kind of my only foray at that up until that point was actually when I was 7 or 8. My mom took me door knocking for Senator Barbara Mikulski, who obviously is just a female icon. But when I was even in law school, I remember I graduated in 2008, and many of my classmates were working on presidential campaigns, and they were the kids who were sleeping on couches in Iowa and New Hampshire, and I was the kid who was, writing award-winning, law papers and competing in the moot court competition, and and I was focused kind of on school and the law journal, and I thought, oh my gosh, these kids, such delinquents, like how are they ever going to get jobs? That's how naive I was, because little did I know
Yeah.
that we would graduate and they'd be first into the White House and the executive offices of agencies. And I just didn't realize that that was how the world worked. It sounds so cliche, right? But the idea of, yes, of course, it's kind of what you know, but it's also who you know.
Yeah.
So after I clerked, and then I went to a law firm for a couple of years. I'm the one who was kind of knocking on their door, saying, "Hey, remember me from law school? Would love for you to consider or share my resume with your principal." And so I interviewed and was lucky enough that thanks to people who were able to float my resume, and a strong resume, was able to interview and land a job as a senior advisor at the State Department. And so worked under Secretary Clinton for a year, and then under Secretary Kerry for 2 years, before, out of the blue, I got an email to my kind of a small connection to Yale, my aya.yale.edu account, which was my Hotmail account. I thought it was like a spam email because I had at
Yeah.
that point had transferred all of my contacts to Gmail. And so when I got the email, I actually thought it was like some sort of joke, but it was a weird joke. So I
Mhm.
deleted the email, mentioned it to my husband, and he was like, that's a weird, it's not like they're asking for your bank account numbers, for um And so I'm glad that I responded because I was then able to interview and then moved over to the White House to become First Lady Michelle Obama's policy director.
Wait, so let's go back for a second. So you think this is a spam? Maybe it's almost like the equivalent of oh my gosh, who is the email from?
Yeah. Yeah, it was like, I mean, it looked legitimate enough in the sense that it was like from the director of international affairs or whatever. Um, but I had never applied
Okay.
uh to her office. I mean, candidly, when you're at the State Department and you're in kind of a policy role, the East Wing isn't something you would necessarily consider as the next step.
Mhm.
I actually got guidance from my colleagues at that time, some of whom are now ambassadors, who one actually literally said, are you sure you want to even consider that job? Because like, what are you going to do after that? Flip burgers? I was like, "Oh
Wait,
gosh, maybe this is viewed." I mean, some people
yeah.
in the policy world view it as policy light. The first lady is not a US government position, they're not salaried, and so I think sometimes people feel like they work on the periphery of the hardcore, world of policy. But I will say I learned so much from her. I learned so much on how do you communicate with a world that is paying less and less attention to politics and policy, candidly.
Mhm.
And that was something that I hadn't learned at Yale or Oxford or Yale Law School, or at the State Department. And so I think, for me, it was important to appreciate um, how sometimes taking a slight kind of step, I mean, I wouldn't say going to the White House is off the beaten path, but it was certainly not something I, could have said when I was in college or in law school that that was my path.
That's pretty amazing. And so some of the issues that you were focused on there were often related to entrepreneurship. It was private sector investment, infrastructure, women's issues. I mean, let's remember, Michelle Obama wasn't just any first lady that, I think so many of the first ladies often, don't necessarily get the light of all the things that they were involved with, but it was everything from women's issues to engagement with young religious communities, climate change. If I remember correctly, things like Let Girls Learn. These were enormous initiatives, as well as like budget development for all of these initiatives. These were no small stakes. Can you tell me a little bit about, you go from state, which is very much focused on the foreign policy and our relationships, at a time when, frankly, I guess we were in a place of mending our relationships, um, into, a White House that, I think about 2008 and all your friends were I was like, I knew many of your friends. I was one of those kids staying on couches, uh, for President Obama. Um, and you're absolutely right. I think I wanna just take us back for a second because it's an important point, is that, I have often heard people say, "Well, why volunteer?" Or why get involved at that level? And the reality is so many of the people that were involved in volunteers end up being, paid in a paid position in public service in a short, with a very short stint. Um, I think that's an important one. Not enough people, I think, know. They assume, "Oh, well, I volunteer," and then when that volunteering is over, but if you're incredibly ambitious, I know so many people who started, in those campaigns and end up in a Senate office or end up in a congressional office. Um, but then you parlay that into now, you know, a really rich environment of the First Lady's office. Tell me about some of the things that I think that you probably didn't think about that you ended up having to apply some of that expertise that you built up in the State Department.
Yeah, so I think there were, quite a number, but I'll hone in on a
Yeah.
couple. One I think was identifying issues, right? Just knowing that you can't do everything on every topic, and there's got to be a discipline there, which certainly is not my nature, right? I wanna engage on every issue that comes across my table, and I think it really does require you to be thoughtful and to hold back a little bit, knowing that what you may lose in breadth, you can gain in depth. So she was so strategic in figuring out what are those issues of national importance that weren't getting the level of attention they needed. And I think it's an important lesson for today, which is there is so much divisiveness. There are so many things that um, where we find ourselves worlds apart. But there's also so much glue that keeps us together, and those are the low hanging fruit. And I think that's where issues like getting more kids into 2 and 4 year colleges, ensuring that we obviously were able to connect around girls' education, ensuring that girls don't drop out of middle and high school,
Mhm.
that they get supported here in the U.S. and across the world. Making sure the kids are getting the right, nutrition and exercise activity that they need to excel are just kind of bipartisan issues. There's clearly consensus, and we ought to just be in a lot better of a position than we are today. And I think that's, I think a really great way to think about where a person can add value. And then I think the second kind of key lesson was how do you meet people where they are? So at
Mm.
the State Department, I think sometimes the approach was you put out a press release and maybe the State Department press corps reads it, but maybe no one else does. Clearly your job is not done. And I think that, to me was eye-opening of figuring out where are people and how do you meet them there? So is that late night TV? Okay, well then think about doing carpool karaoke. Is it TV shows where you try to pitch to executive producers and writers that your storyline gets to be a part of that. And I think just the third kind of key lesson, she had it in all of her approach was entertain them first, educate them, kind of right after next. And I think that's where in a world where people I think are either jaded or they're exhausted, sometimes they're less inclined to tune into those hard hitting issues. So how do you find a way to approach heavy substantive topics in a slightly lighthearted way initially so that that's your hook and you can bring them in to actually become more informed on a given topic and ultimately with the hope of engaging them to get them to act on an issue.
Hey, listeners, super exciting news. I'm going to let you in on a top secret innovation that Vibes AI has been working on. Vibes AI has just dropped new audio vibrational therapies. If you're looking to enhance your memory, relaxation, focus, or overall cognitive wellness, this one's for you. Vibes AI has been working with certified sound and music therapists to design vibrational audio therapies that are designed to connect your body, mind, and intention. You can choose vibrational therapies that reduce anxiety, encourage deep focus, enhance concentration, and improve cognitive function, bringing you back to a healthy alignment. Don't miss out on this incredible cognitive wellness innovation. I want you to open up your favorite podcasting platform and search for Vibes AI, or simply ask Alexa, open Vibes Therapy to follow the Vibes AI frequency.
Welcome back.
You've had such a remarkable journey. And by the way, we're only at the middle, team. Um, you think a little bit about that. I've always believed that there were people in my journey who either opened a door for me or sponsored something that maybe I couldn't have otherwise gotten there on my own. Can you talk a little bit about during your journey, who were some of the people that really sponsored your success?
I think this is such an important question that you're asking because I do think um, sometimes people think about sort of advisors, and there's such a sharp contrast between that and sponsors. And I think, especially for women, we are willing to just accept having advisors, but we just need to kind of find the right folks who are willing to roll up their sleeves and actually do the hard work, which is to help kind of pitch you, who are willing to be in the room when you're not and advocate for you. So for me, there's so many people who I think played a part. Certainly, when I think about my family's journey, it was this amazing superintendent of the local school system who, when my dad said, I'm coming from a very different system to the Baltimore City school system, and the superintendent basically said, can you hack it? And my dad's honest answer was, let me try. And he gave my dad a shot. And my dad only retired about 5 years ago. He was the oldest public school teacher in the state of Maryland at the age of 80. I think back to that superintendent. I think back to the vice principal of my dad's school who helped us move into the apartment, who helped vouch for my parents as they were starting a bank account. I just took a trip with a professor from Yale who, when I didn't have that confidence in myself, he did. And he was the Professor Roger Smith. I want to give him a shout out. Who, he was like a world-class professor who everyone knew his name. And he vouched for me, and his word went such a long way when I was applying for scholarships and that sort of thing. And just having him support me gave me so much more confidence. And then I think it was just other women who, especially in my journey today as a working mom, who's managing to try to stay afloat with a 6-year-old and a now 1-year old, who just kind of let me vent when I need it, who give me little tidbits of, kind of maternal, paternal, parental hacks. So I think it's kind of, it's those sponsors who every step of the way were in the trenches with me.
A part of this journey was actually running for public office. Um, I would imagine that had first of all, and if I remember correctly, this was actually running for public office at a time that you also weren't you pregnant, or you were
Yeah,
very
I
quickly
had
about
just
to
had
have
a
you had
baby.
just had a
Yeah,
baby, right?
just had
Okay.
a baby. Yeah.
Not an easy feat, ladies and gentlemen, not an easy feat. And if I remember correctly, you were door knocking with her in your arms,
Yeah.
which was really this fantastic idea. I think that actually now I truly understand that it harkens back to probably when your mother took you door knocking.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and I will say, Joanna, you were so wonderfully helpful when I was running, and I came to you and I asked for your support. So thank you for that. Yeah, so when I was first approached about running, it was not anything I was contemplating. I had just left the White House. This was after the 2016 election. I had a lot to say about what had happened. And as I was giving speeches, I had had a few folks come up to me and say, like, well, why aren't you running? The passion, the experience is there. And I would look down and I couldn't even see my feet. But I think ultimately I realized that, well, I couldn't see my feet. I could see the future. And I think that was a strong reason for me running as a first time mom, was because it's about a future of what's a world that our daughters and sons grow up in. I launched my campaign on my daughter's third-month birthday. I announced as the first policy that I wanted to implement, making Maryland the first state in the nation to guarantee 3 months of paid family leave. I was running as the only woman against 8 men. It's embarrassing when you think about the diversity of a state like Maryland. In our last election cycle, we again had 8 or 9 men, not a single woman running. So we still have our work cut out for us. But it was, and continues to be important to me to have an electorate, and well, have electeds that are as diverse as our electorate. And we're still so far from that, particularly when you think about executive office. I'm really proud that I am the only woman who runs one of the 10 national resettlement agencies, but with an organization that has 3/4 of our staff are women.
Mhm.
And that's not unique to nonprofits. Again, clearly we have our work cut out for us. I mean, this coming from the world that you work in. It is really sad to see that in 2024 we still are where we are. We've made some strides, but we still have a ways to go.
Absolutely. What did the journey of running for elected office teach you?
Um, be prepared for some of your best friends to disappoint you and complete strangers to pleasantly surprise you. My husband's running for governor right now, and it's one of the pieces of advice give him because you have to have kind of leather for skin. You're just some of what you need is going to come from inner strength, and some of what you need is going to come from that resiliency to not take things personally.
I think that's amazing advice for just about anything, but absolutely. I actually think that we focus so much on the politics of it as opposed to these are folks that are running for public service. And public service has a really finite definition about what their representation. And so the reason you got my support and will always have my support is because it is clear to me that you are very much come out of that place of public servant, first, and genuinely care about your constituency and the people around you. I'd love to talk about you go from that now into your role in the non-for-profit world with Global Refuge. I remember talking with you and having a couple of one-on-one conversations, and I think that you were actually a little surprised by this opportunity. Um, I think talk to us and listeners about, you come out of what's a loss. Losses are tough. There's a ton to be learned from there. And I always look at, something like that. It's not necessarily about a failure. It's like, what did you learn? And then how do you take what you've learned now and apply it to maybe whatever the next chapter will be? Tell us a little bit about that transition.
It's such a apt question, and I think what you described is precisely how I feel, and even what I tell my 6-year-old, which is it's not just a loss, right? It's a lesson. But after the sting, it's not like it doesn't hurt. It to me is kind of, what do you make of it? So I am so glad that I ran. I think I certainly kind of learned and gained a skill set that I'd never really thought as much about, which is like, being a public figure, being out there, putting yourself out there, the public speaking pieces. I never thought that I was good at it. I'd never really tried it as well, and so I came out of the experience thinking, okay, well, what do I want to do next? I still want to have impact. Obviously, there are so many important issues right now, whether it's immigration or reproductive rights, where you realize that there is so much at stake. And so I was approached about this job again, kind of got an email out of the blue,
This time, not in the spam folder, right?
and not in the spam folder, but I did put it into my trash because I opened up the prospectus. I, um, saw the name. I thought that you had to be Lutheran because the organization had been called Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, and kind of had mistaken its mission. Uh, my husband again was involved, where that night I talked to him about the opportunity, and I said, I don't know the organization, and assume it's not for me, and maybe they had mistaken kind of my identity. um, and he said, well, this was the end of 2018. Immigration is a hot button issue. You're an immigrant by background. You talked a lot about it on the campaign trail. It's a national nonprofit headquartered kind of in your hometown. Seems like it's worth a conversation. I was like, gosh, when you put it that way, I suppose it does seem like it is. So I'm so glad that I did. I had a conversation with the executive search firm and the board search committee, realized that it was this great organization that perhaps had been kind of kept as a well kept secret. Um, and so I interviewed and was really excited about taking on the job in 2019.
So tell me a little bit about what is driving or inspiring you today in this role.
So I know that this country has given so much to me and my family. I know that uh, we also need immigrants as much as they need us. And yet you see the polling these days, you turn on the TV or pick up a newspaper and you hear this negative narrative about immigrants as leeches on taxpayer dollars, as a burden on cities. You see political leaders of, on both sides of the aisle, not standing up for our country being a welcoming nation. And I just know that whether it's the economic self interest, the national security considerations, the history of our nation, immigrants and immigration are critical to us remaining a superpower. And so I'm really excited leading the largest faith based national nonprofit dedicated to immigrants and immigration issues. To be that voice, to be able to provide those services that, though formally my family, we were not refugees, we know what it was to get a warm welcome, and we know how important that was to our trajectory and to kind of writing our own American story. And so my hope is that we can kind of pay it forward to the next generation of immigrants.
Why do you think it's such a hot button issue? Is it the time that we are in? Is it that it's always been a hot button issue? This is something, as you know, that is so near and dear to my heart in so many ways. For listeners, my grandmother was an undocumented um, immigrant from Mexico in the early 1900s and lived undocumented until the 80s when, President Reagan passed a couple of bills, one of which actually enabled her to become a citizen of this country. She paid taxes here. She was somebody who actually had a child here, so she had a citizen of this country. But today, she would be called, actually, my grandmother would be called an anchor baby. And, it's this awful, lexicon, this. When I think about the rhetoric and the conversation we're having often, I immediately go, wait, you're talking about the people that I come from. I don't get here without their journey. So tell me a little bit about this time that we're finding ourselves in.
It's a great way to give context to where we are, because I do think it's important to contextualize anti-immigration sentiment, xenophobia is age old. Sometimes people wonder, where's the O'Mara part of your name come from? Well, that's Colin Patrick O'Mara, and his family would tell you about the hatred that Irish immigrants
Mhm.
faced. And so I think it's I'm so grateful for you sharing your experience, because I think all of us need to express our empathy and connect to the issue, because the truth is that unless you're part of the indigenous community or your family was forced through slavery to come here, someone in your family made an intentional decision to come to the US. And thank goodness for that, right? Thank goodness for this
Yeah.
country for that. And so I've just been grateful, Joanna, for your willingness to, pitch in through the President's Council, because I do think we have to understand that, kind of they are us. It's just
Yeah.
they're the news generation kind of that immigrant wave. And I think some of what I see today is, it kind of it's politics, but it's kind of an unfair matchup, because you have one side that has viewed this as a wedge issue, and they have been successful in politicizing the issue, and the other side has viewed this as their Achilles heel. And so you have this loud narrative of immigrants as crime perpetrating assailants who are fueling the opioid epidemic, and filling a country that's already full, but none of that is true, right? And so that's where we've
Right.
got to fight fiction with fact in terms of explaining that the opioid epidemic is absolutely a national crisis, but it is led by US citizens smuggling drugs for US citizens. That
And let's not start also with big pharma companies, right? That that have incentivized physicians to overprescribe, right? Um, that actually comes from within our own borders, the opioid
yeah.
uh, conflict that we have today. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, even just when you think about this crime narrative, when you actually look at the data of the 21 counties that kind of span our southern border, they're actually safer than counties on the interior. When you look at the top 10 cities that have received refugees, and longitudinal studies showed that 9 out of 10 were actually much safer in terms of economic crime, violent crime, petty crime. The one exception was West Springfield, Massachusetts, and that was related to the opioid epidemic. And so I think this is where, to have a fair fight, we do need to make sure that the American public is informed so that they are, making decisions whether to support or oppose immigration based on fact, as opposed to fear mongering.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think that one of the things that we often get away from is that in reality, it is not going to be an immigrant who's coming to take your job either in the world of jobs where we have over 11 million open jobs in this country. In fact, I reported to somebody in the world of AI that AI is going to take your role before an immigrant is. Like in all honestly, like let's be really clear, automation and artificial intelligence are the new GLP-1 antagonist of jobs in this country. And so, this is, I always think about it from this perspective. It's like you can get all the growth. It's with less filling of the people. And as sad as that is how business operates and thinks about efficiency. And it has zero to do with immigration. And I can remember a time in a very, very recent past during the Trump administration when companies were actually, because we could not get enough people in to cover the roles that we had in the area of artificial intelligence, we were having to actually place offices in Mexico and in Canada, making investments because those were the countries that were letting them in. So we are actually doing ourselves an enormous economic disservice um, at this time. And I think one of the things that you are so great at, and I think we in the business community need to get better at, is actually bringing that narrative to people in a way that does meet them where they're at, because that is not the narrative that is out there.
Exactly right. And I mean, even recently there was a study, there was an opinion put out by an editorial board, just talking about how 1,100 counties would have experienced population decline, but for immigration. And even this narrative of the country is full, people have to understand that we've the lowest birth rate since the census has been tracking this issue. If we don't have immigration, we don't have the vibrant workforce, exactly to your point about the jobs that are going unfilled right now, um, that we won't remain an economic superpower. And we just have to look around the world to see whether it's competing against China, where China has moved from a one-child policy to encouraging 2 and now 3 children. Japan, a country that has, in recent years, experienced stagnation because of an aging population. That even Social Security and Medicare don't stay afloat unless we have a workforce that includes strong immigration.
I know immigration policy and terminology often can be complex, and we've seen it even in our favorite politicians at recent events. Can you break down what the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker is?
Yeah, important question. When I first started in this job, I, kind of studied up to make sure I knew the technical differences, and then of course I visited some of our team on the front lines in Arizona, New Mexico, and I realized that actually they use the words interchangeably, intentionally, because in some ways, that the commonality is that both populations are often fleeing the same kinds of crises: war, gang violence, political, religious, persecution on the basis of LGBTQ, um, and they're seeking refuge. But the difference is that a refugee is someone who has crossed an international border. They've applied through the UN system. They may have, gone into the U.S. embassy to do an interview. They wait in place until they get admission to the U.S. or another host nation. Uh, Less than 1% of refugees will ever be resettled. So it's horrific when you think about the dire circumstances that they've both fled, and sometimes in even the refugee camps, the difficult circumstances in which they're waiting in a holding pattern. Whereas an asylum seeker is someone who has come to U.S. soil. So, they may have tried to reach the southern border. The ability to apply for asylum actually requires you to have reached a U.S. soil. And so sometimes when people say, well, they've got to come the right way, um, they are actually coming the right way if they're seeking asylum to come to the southern border, because that is the only way the right becomes usable to apply. And so kind of that is the difference.
So they actually have to show up at the border to be
That's
able
right.
to
To seek
actually
asylum.
seek the asylum. Gotcha. Um, what when you think about the asylum system, right? And I think it's often been described as overwhelmed or incredibly broken. What can we learn from the design principles about implementing mends, fixes, or even a better one?
Part of it is understanding. I mean, your question on what's the difference between a refugee and asylum seeker is a great preface to this question, because for refugee resettlement, to your comment about laws in the 1980, the Refugee Assistance Program was created in 1980. There is a complex algorithm that determines where a refugee family will ultimately be relocated. It considers the job market, affordable housing, where there's capacity in the local community to receive and welcome immigrants. And so there's an intentional decision made. There's an infrastructure that exists across the country in terms of accepting and resettling refugees. For an asylum seeker, they will come across the southern border, they'll be processed, and then it's essentially a free for all, because what you've seen in the busing from Florida and from Texas is simply taking advantage
Yeah.
of kind of an unstructured and sometimes chaotic system. And so our advocacy has been, look, immigration's a federal issue. You shouldn't see state by state laws, whether it's, Texas's SB4 or Iowa's new law, because you can't have a checkerboard of different policies of how to treat immigrants. But if it is a federal issue, then there should be a national system for asylum seekers as well. And so I think that there's an opportunity to learn from the successes of what has been for 4 decades a bipartisan program in the refugee resettlement system.
I've always seen you as a change agent. And I really do believe that there can be a better future. I think that's why you're in it. Um, Tell me a little bit about the future that you hope for and what it's going to take to make that future a reality.
My hope is that in the immigration space, people understand that immigration is not just the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. And it is, we're a charitable organization, but immigration is not just charity alone. It is necessity. It is something that we don't have the luxury of playing political pinball with. But that's going to require our political leaders to stop grandstanding. That's a Herculean feat in a
No
time
kidding.
where people have frankly come to accept Congress being dysfunctional and politicians not fixing problems. And so that's where, kind of the two sides of the coin right now are immigration is the top issue. It's taken over inflation,
Yes.
the climate
But it's
crisis.
connected to those 2 things, right? It's not
Exactly.
independent of those 2
Right.
things. Isn't it true? And if I remember correctly, I certainly saw it, in the, and certainly in the employment side of the equation that, if we wanna continue having inflationary prices, let's continue to have 11 million open jobs. It is a market demand problem.
Exactly
Um,
right. That's exactly. And so this is the price premium that we pay for xenophobic anti-immigration policies, right? And so I think that's where, whether it's having avocado for avocado toast, whether it's having the doctor so you're not waiting to see a general practitioner, whether it's who takes care of our kids and our parents, immigration is an essential element to the world that we know and the world we love. And so I think that's where I hope, just as immigration has become a hot button issue and at the forefront, that people do take the time to get better informed. Global Refuge puts out kind of regular myth busting materials. But that once people do get informed, my hope is that people get activated, because right now it's a one-sided fight and it can't just be kind of white nationalists that are dictating policy on immigration. And so I hope that our organization can play a part in getting people to act.
Yeah, great design has always been about intention, but more importantly, putting that intention to action. How can people get involved with Global Refuge and its mission to walk alongside America's newcomers?
I am so glad you asked. So we have a revamped website along with our revised brand of Global Refuge. So if you go to globalrefuge.org, we have lots of materials that explain who we are, what we do, and there's everything from telling your member of Congress that you care about this issue, to even welcoming into your home an unaccompanied child for a few weeks as we reunite them with their parent or guardian. And so there's lots of ways to get engaged, and we hope your audience takes advantage.
Difference, specifically cultural difference, is viewed in such a derogatory fashion. It's something I think a lot of children from ethnic households can relate to. Did you mean my great great grandmother, Aurora?
Yes, yes. I referred to her as grandma. What I meant was my great grandmother, to whom all my cousins and I referred to as grandma, whereas my mother's mom was nicknamed Mama Rose. That said, my great grandmother, Aurora Rodriguez, was born in 1905 in Piedras Negras, Coahuila, Mexico. And she came to the United States at age 7 during the Mexican Revolution in 1912. She remained undocumented until the 1980s, when President Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, after having worked for years as a tax-paying domestic worker who worked in hospitals and caring for people's homes and her children and her grandchildren. She was one out of an estimated 3 million people, mostly of Mexican American descent, who gained documented status.
It rings a lot of truth for so many people that had to take a leap of faith to a better life.
Secretary Madeleine Albright once said, "Immigrants have made America great as the world leader in business, science, higher education, and innovation." And I know that's the truth. Only in America is the story of Grace Hopper, Katherine Johnson, Radia Perlman, Steve Jobs, or even Jeff Bezos possible. And only in America can a middle-class, dyslexic, Jewish Mexican American Star Trek nerd from San Antonio, Texas, make it to be the CEO of an AI company. That is the beauty of the opportunity of the idea of America.
And you know what? The negative narrative of immigration, the discussion removes humanity from conversation. Krish said it herself. Immigration is key for the U.S. to be a superpower. And I think it's time we dispel some myth. Immigration takes jobs from Native workers. Reality is, research shows little to no negative long-term impact on Native wages or employment. The lie that immigrants are a drain on public resources. The truth is, immigrants generally pay more into taxes than they receive in benefits, especially in the long term. The myth that immigration increases crime rates. In truth, immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. And the myth, a border wall will stop illegal immigration. Many undocumented immigrants enter legally and overstay their visa. A wall is not going to address what a plane can go across. Border walls do not deter hope for a better tomorrow.
We, the U.S., the us in the United States, need immigrants as much as they need us. And we need them for economic growth. Immigration increases the productive capacity of our economy and raises GDP. Immigrants contribute to innovation, entrepreneurship, and the overall economic dynamism that we have in the U.S. marketplace. The other thing that it's really important for is they're a complement to our labor force. Immigrants often take jobs that complement rather than compete with native workers. And more importantly than anything, for their fiscal contributions. Overall, immigration has had a net positive effect on government budgets at the federal, state, and local levels. And lastly, Rachel, I think this one's really important because it's an election year. And we need to talk about how this election year, we are really working towards revitalizing our communities, whether it is you live in an urban center or a rural community. The reality is that immigrants often settle in and help revitalize declining urban and rural areas. They are the lifeblood of what's going on in New York City, and they are absolutely making it possible for businesses in the Hudson Valley, which is a more rural area of New York State, flourish. And that's why I'm so passionate about being on Krish's President's Council at Global Refuge. Let's remember that it's driven by the belief in human dignity and the intrinsic value of every person. I joined the President's Council because I know that Global Refuge has provided the resources, guidance, and community to help forge a new way forward for new Americans. They've committed to helping people reimagine the possibilities while providing a soft place for them to land. And they've been doing it since about 1939. And in that time, they've built a legacy of compassion by walking alongside of more than 750,000 new neighbors as they've rebuilt their lives in the United States. Listeners, I want you to slide over to globalrefuge.org and help support Krish and her team's efforts at Global Refuge to design a better welcome to the U.S. for everyone, everywhere, every single day.
Like the statue in New York's harbor, let's carry that torch forward and read us out.
This episode was written and produced by the AI Design Corps at Aurora 21 in the heart of New York's magical Hudson Valley. Special thanks to the musical talents of Rachel Bickley, our podcast sound designer. Our theme music was composed by Substance Studios. If you're already following the show, you're well on your way to designing a better future. If not, what are you waiting for? It's time to join the magic. Go to your favorite podcast service and search Designed By with Joanna Peña-Bickley and hit follow.
Design the future.